I'm Jane Graham-Jennings, Executive Director of the Women's Community, and we'll be presenting today, and we'll kind of get into the whole thing.
Okay, and I'm Lee Shipboy from Peaceful Solutions Counseling. We'll do a little longer introduction in a little bit. So I want to thank Northcentral Technical College for providing this space. They do this free of charge, for those of you that don't know that, so a big thank you to NTC for that. I want to talk just a little bit about Wausau Metro Strong. I'm one of the members of the executive committee. Wausau Metro Strong was started after the March 22nd, 2017 tragic deaths. And our mission statement, as you can see, is committed to building a safe community for all. The pillars of the volunteer group are to unify, prepare, support, inform, and educate those in our community. So it's a wide variety of different people throughout the community. We have approximately 70 members at this point in time. The committees are the executive committee, the business committee, legal committee, domestic abuse, and communication. And so we are trying to give information to the community on a variety of different topics to help people be safe in many different areas of their life, all areas of their lives, I should say. Here are the list of the member organizations that we have. So you can see it's a wide variety of different businesses, for-profit, non-profit organizations. You can find us on Facebook.com/Wausau Metro Strong. We're also on LinkedIn. We have monthly meetings. We'd love to have more members. We meet on, excuse me, the fourth Tuesday of the month from noon to 1. And we meet in the NTC Center for Business and Industry, which is one building over that way. So I just want to recap. These are some of the other presentations that happened on September 4th. Chad Biller from the Marathon County Sheriff's Department did evaluation of emergency action plans for businesses. And now we're going to do part 2 of our 3-part series on why it's important for me, my business, and my employees to know about domestic violence. Do you want to talk a little bit about you?
So my background, pretty much from my formative years, I have been an advocate for the disenfranchised and have always been pursuing justice for the people who are oppressed and put upon. So my professional career has followed that trajectory. I have been with the women's community for 23 years. I have been director for 20. Before that, I worked at another domestic abuse sexual assault agency, so my entire history is about that. One of the things that we'll be talking a little bit about today to kind of give some context again around why it's so hard to talk about domestic violence. I was certified as a law enforcement trainer in 1996 through the Violence Against Women Act, where we realized that the understanding that law enforcement had around these interpersonal crimes and the social stigma that comes with that and the reasons why they're so hard to investigate. So I was certified to do that, and I train actually here at NTC. I train the recruits every semester on investigating domestic violence and sexual assault because they are so complex, and to try to help people understand the mindset. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that today as well.
And my name is Lee Shipboy. I'm the Executive Director of Peaceful Solutions Counseling. I'm a licensed mental health therapist. Have been working in this area for the last 37 years. At the beginning of my career, I was at Children's Service Society of Wisconsin, and I did treatment foster care work for 3 years, where I licensed foster parents, recruited foster parents, and then I had children that were placed in those homes, mainly teenagers, that I was doing family therapy, trying to help them get reunified with their families. And then after 3 years, I was an outpatient psychotherapist for them. That's really what my training was in graduate school. And then for about 15 years, almost exclusively my caseload was domestic violence victims or sexual abuse victims, as well as incest victims from the ages of 3 up through 17, and adult survivors of sexual assault. I then was the clinic director at Children's Service Society for a number of years, and then left Children's and started Peaceful Solutions Counseling, so I'm one of the co-founders of that agency. We do mental health counseling as well as alcohol and drug abuse counseling, and we specialize in domestic violence. So all of my staff are trained in dealing with helping victims who've been abused by an intimate partner, as well as we run something called the SAFE program, which stands for Stopping Abuse for Everyone, and that is a domestic abusers treatment program. We run about 5 groups a week of men, 99% of them court-ordered to come to treatment, and it is our charge then to try to help them change that abusive behavior. Like Jane, I'm also an expert witness. I provide expert witness testimony around the state on child sexual abuse and why children don't report right away, or why they don't report at all, as well as domestic violence, why victims might not report or why they can't.
So, and I think it's important, again, when we're talking about the context of why this issue is so hard to talk about, even though we talk about it more now than we did even 20 years ago when I started, it still is something that is shrouded in stigma. And we have a really hard time understanding it, and we still tend to blame victims for what is happening in their relationship. So the expert testimony is partially to help educate jurors. That is our job when we go in. We are asked questions specifically around issues of victim behavior to help jurors try to understand what seems like counterintuitive behavior, but actually when you understand victimization and understand what it's like to be in the shoes of someone living in a terrorism household, then the behaviors are not really counterintuitive, they make a lot of sense.
So we're just going to do a short summary of what we did in session 1 for people who were not here at session 1, and also this is being videotaped for the public access channel. So we are thankful for them as well for doing this, and want to make sure that we include everything that needs to be included. You want to talk about this?
So the whole reason why Wausau Metro Strong exists is because of the tragedy in our community that was a result of a domestic abuse offender who believed his rights were more important than the lives of other human beings. Because someone was trying to take what he believed is his control and his power away from him, and because his wife would not do exactly what he said, he then decided that he was entitled to take the lives of other people. That is why we're here, for the 4 lives that were lost. Diane and Karen were heroes in this event, and they were co-workers of the victim, of the spouse of the murderer, and their response saved that woman's life. And as a result, they lost their lives in helping their co-worker. That's why it's really important for places of employment to understand domestic violence and how dangerous it is, so that we can have safety plans in place of how people can keep their employees and their co-workers safe, and how to safely respond to that. So this is why we're here, and we can never forget that.
And the third victim was Sarah Cortzon, who was the divorce lawyer for the woman in the abusive relationship. The murderer felt that she deserved to die because she was trying to help his wife be able to divorce him, and I believe there was also some child custody issues or child, that's what I'm looking for.
Child support.
Thank you, child support issues. And then the last victim was Detective Jason Wyman, who reported to the scene to help stop the abuse and the murdering that was going on. So this is the definition that we use of domestic violence. It is a pattern, and it's a very important word. It's a pattern of assaultive and coercive behaviors, including physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological attacks, as well as economic coercion that adults or adolescents use against their intimate partners. I want to make the point that a lot of people think domestic violence automatically begins in adulthood. It doesn't. It begins oftentimes in adolescence. You will see what we call dating violence in high schools. And those abusers grow up to be the adult abusers that we see. So Jane and I are going to use these terms interchangeably today. We're going to use domestic abuse, domestic violence. I might also use the term intimate partner violence. That's a term that was coined by the Centers for Disease Control. So we use those all meaning the same thing.
The thing that's important to understand about the cycle, and that this is an ongoing pattern of behavior, it's not one explosive episode. When we're talking about domestic abuse, it's an ongoing pattern of behavior. It's not an anger management problem.
Right.
So people want to say, oh, if they go get anger management, it will be fine. It's not that. It is choice, it is manipulation, and it's ongoing and intentional. So that's very different than someone who doesn't know how to control their anger.
So we just want to review again why it's so tough to talk about this. A lot of people feel uncomfortable when we talk about domestic violence, and there's a couple reasons for that. One, a lot of times when we look at that power and control wheel, you might see a description that you're like, geez, that's my brother, or my husband has done this to me, or I know a family friend or relative, and that makes it hard. But what you need to also remember is, was it a one isolated thing, or is it a pattern, right? Because like if you look at emotional abuse, calling bad names, a lot of people have called an intimate partner a bad name. It doesn't mean that they're an abuser. You need to look at the whole picture of that pattern. A big part of why I think our culture as a whole doesn't speak up and say something about domestic violence is because historically we've kind of had a belief system that a man's home is his castle, and what happens inside that home isn't anybody else's business. I'll share with you a story that I'm not proud about this story. When I was 18 years old, my then boyfriend, who's now my husband, and I were at a club in Wausau. It was back when the drinking age was 18. And as we exited the club one night, I swore I saw a guy punch a woman and she went to the ground. And I was like, oh, we need to do something. And my boyfriend's like, nope, it's none of our business. Nope, that isn't what you saw. And like skirted me away. To this day, that kills me that I listened to him and I didn't do anything about that. We were young, we were stupid. We had also been raised in a culture where you don't get involved in other people's relationships. It's none of your business, and so you walk away. I think that culture still remains in our country and in our state here, in our city, and we need to get over that, quite frankly. We need to realize that, as the saying goes, it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to keep community members safe, and we need to speak up and say something when we see something. So the other part of this is that defense mechanisms will kick in. We see this a lot of times when we talk to juries and try to explain to jurors, because a lot of times when you hear really horrific things that are done to a human being by another human being, our brains just can't compute that. It's like, well, that can't be. Like, there's got to be some reason why that person did that horrible, nasty thing to the other one. So automatically what our brains jump to is, the victim must have done something. Like, they deserve this. They provoked it. There has to be something they did that this happened to them. It's just the way the brain works to try to make sense of things that don't make sense. How prevalent is this? From 2005 to 2015, Marathon County had 10 homicides and 4 suicides related to intimate partner violence. Average number of arrests in a week is 11 in Marathon County. And the district attorney's office had 563 cases for arrest for domestic violence in 2018. And there were an additional 109 cases that were referred by law enforcement to the DA, meaning they didn't make an arrest on the scene, but they referred it to the district attorney for them to decide if they should be charged. Can you talk about this? What do you want me to? Okay, so the other thing that a lot of people are shocked and surprised when I tell them this, that there's a huge link between the mass shootings that have occurred in our country and domestic violence. A large percentage of those perpetrators were domestic violence abusers. They either abused women, threatened women, or they made disparaging remarks about women. So their belief system, their mindset, is that there's something wrong with women. There's something very different about them, or there's something evil about them. And then sometimes coupled with that, other belief systems that then they decide that they want to do these massive shootings. Now, unfortunately, a lot of those perpetrators are not able to be interviewed because they're dead after they've been shot by law enforcement. So I think that there's going to be more, unfortunately, shootings, and there's going to be better response, and then people are going to be able to take the abuser into custody and do more interviews, and the FBI is probably going to come out with all kinds of new information about what the motivations are. But you can't ignore the fact, if you look at the top, like the Las Vegas shooting, that was October of 2017, the death toll was 58. That man had domestic abuser issues, as well as the Pulse nightclub, Virginia Tech University. A lot of these are centered around really misogyny is the best way to put it. Okay, 7 reasons employers should address domestic violence. First one is that domestic violence affects many employees. 1 out of 3 women and 1 out of 4 men have experienced some form of physical violence by an intimate partner. So for people who are watching this or here today and think, oh, this doesn't happen at my workplace, yes, it does. It is way more prevalent than you probably think.
One of the takeaways we want to make sure people take from all of these series is you know someone who is a victim of abuse. Whether you are aware that you know it or not, you absolutely know someone. So it absolutely affects every person in this community.
Number 2, domestic violence is a security concern and a liability concern. Interestingly, 94% of corporate security directors rank DV as a high security problem, 94%. It's also a performance and productivity concern. One study of batters showed that 41% of them had job performance problems and 48% had difficulty concentrating on the job as a result of their abusive behaviors. Now, sometimes that's because, believe it or not, they're feeling guilty about what they've done, and that's bothering them. Sometimes it's that they're obsessing about where their partner is, what she's doing, and trying to control her, and they can't focus on their job. Between 21 and 60% of victims of domestic violence lose their jobs due to reasons stemming from the abuse.
So that could be reasons that their absenteeism has passed the threshold of what a company will allow. There's a variety of other reasons. We also need to help people understand going to a place of employment of a victim is a tactic commonly used by abusive people. They intentionally continue to show up at a place of employment in an attempt to have their partner fired. And what usually happens is the employer says to the victim, you need to have your partner stay away from here. Tell them to stop coming here. If they come here again, you're going to lose your job. If victims could control what their abusive partners are doing, they would be able to. They can't. This is an intentional tactic that abusive people use so that their victims are financially dependent upon them. So until we change the paradigm, places of employment have all the authority to say, this person is trespassing on our property, you are not allowed to be here, go away. Asking a victim to control their partner is putting that victim in harm's way as well as your place of employment. It's a very common tactic that people really need to be thinking about when you're developing safety plans for your employment.
And it's a health concern. Reason number 4, the cost of intimate partner violence is astounding. $5.8 billion each year, $4.1 billion of which is for direct medical and mental health care services. In a 2002 survey of senior corporate executives, 91% said that domestic violence affects both the private and working lives of their employees. Reason 6, taking action in response to domestic violence works. When a sample of group of 40 abused employees at a factory began using the domestic abuse counseling services that were offered through their workplace, the average absence rate before that was very high. After they went through that counseling, then they reduced their absenteeism rates to normal rates. And the last one is that employers can make a difference. Numerous corporations, government agencies, and domestic violence experts are addressing domestic violence with great success. You can make a difference in your workplace and in the lives of employees who are facing abuse. We're going to talk a little bit later about how to develop a policy to help keep everyone safe at your place of employment. The main thing is that you need to address it and know that it's there and not just pretend like put your head in the sand and say we don't need to deal with this.
So we're going to move into some logistics around what Wisconsin has for a mandatory arrest law to try to understand a historical context of what is happening in the lives of victims, how our response to domestic violence has changed, and how you might see that play out in your places of employment.
And how you can use that in your places of employment to help keep people safe.
So in 1987, Wisconsin instituted the mandatory arrest law. And so what that said was, if an officer responds and has probable cause a crime is committed, and the relationship is defined as domestic, and we'll get into what that means, they shall make an arrest. They must arrest someone. The reason that came into play is prior to mandatory arrest, nationwide, the response to domestic violence was, that's none of my business. So if a victim would call for help, law enforcement would show. They would say separate and mediate was kind of the standard of what they did. They treated domestic violence as if it was some kind of family matter and not a crime against another human being. And so there was a movement 40 years ago when these shelters first started. Shelters were started as safe homes here in Wausau. The safe homes were places where people would secretly bring victims into their home because there was no place for them to go. And they were going to be killed or severely injured if they didn't, and there was no one there to protect them. So that's how safe homes started here in Wausau. And then as we started to look at it nationwide as a full response that was needed, shelter programs and funding started to come to our agency so that we could address this issue. And now here we are 40 plus years later, and it's very much a part of our response to domestic violence. Services understanding that victims need ongoing long-term support and they need emergency shelter because there are still victims that are in imminent danger of abuse.
So interestingly, I started doing batters groups 33 years ago, and it was right around the time that we came out with mandatory arrest. And I remember speaking with some officers who were friends of mine, and they said, you know, really, that separate and mediate policy that we have, it's putting me in the position of trying to be a social worker. And I'm not trained as a social worker, I'm a law enforcement officer. And I know that my friends felt very uncomfortable with that. And so when this law came out, there was a little bit of relief, like, okay, the decision-making's taken off of me, now this is what it says I have to do, and I'm gonna do that. Back to what Jane said about making sure that people understand it's a criminal matter, not a family matter, is very interesting as well. So throughout the day, I'm going to give you little insights into batters because I've worked with probably 5,000 of them. One of the things that we do in the SAFE program, at the midway point of an 18-week group program, we meet with each of them individually. And we have a variety of questions that we have them fill out. One of them is a scale of how much responsibility they're taking. Like one of the questions is, I should have been arrested. And it goes from strongly disagree all the way to strongly agree, right? So the guys who say disagree or strongly disagree, this is what we typically say. Okay, so what about that makes you think you shouldn't have been arrested? Well, because, you know, the officers should have thought this, and I was only that. Okay, so what was the behavior you did? Well, you know, I pushed her, yeah, or I slapped her, and I'll go, okay, so usually my next question is, if a stranger did that to your wife, do you think the stranger should be arrested? Well, yeah. I'm like, okay, what's the difference? If a stranger slaps your wife or you slap your wife? It's a crime, you should be arrested. And then they finally, most of them will get that, like, oh. But again, it goes back to that belief system of like, if it's a family situation, somehow it's different. Then we're allowed to be abusive to people who know them really well. You know, think about how crazy that is.
So when we implemented the law, this is the actual statute. So if an adult person is 17 or older engaged in a crime that meets DV criteria, and, so here's a definition that makes it, so sometimes people will say, well, I don't know why someone wasn't arrested, right? If people have this idea of what mandatory arrest is. If the relationship is not defined by statute, which are these things, a spouse, a former spouse, they reside together or formerly resided together, and they have a child in common. So any of those make it a domestic abuse mandatory arrest. Dating relationships may have all of the same tactics, all the same abuse and control going on, but they don't meet the statutory definition of mandatory arrest. So in those situations, there may be the same crimes, but officers are not required to arrest, so there may be some discretion there. So other things that officers have to look at when they are making an arrest is, did any of the behaviors cause intentional infliction of pain or injury, cause impairment of physical condition, is a violation of any of the laws of sexual assault, or they commit an act that would cause the other person to reasonably fear. So this is something that's critically important in understanding when officers are doing their investigation. Is there something that caused a person to reasonably fear that?
And that can be very important in your place of work as well. If you have an employee who is fearful because their partner shows up at work, they're stalking them, he doesn't actually have to have done something physical, like kick her, hit her, or punch her, but if he's done something threatening that's fearful. And I also want to point out we have Chief Ben living with us today from the Wausau PD, here to answer questions that people have, as well as Captain Ben Graham from the Wausau PD. So it's your title right.
So again, they shall make an arrest if one of the following apply. There's probable cause, so that's always part of what law enforcement has to base level. Very different than prosecutors who have to beyond a reasonable doubt. Just a little bit of Civic 101 here. If there is continued likelihood of domestic violence against the victim, if there is evidence of a physical injury, or if they determine that there is a predominant aggressor in this situation.
Anything you guys want to add to that?
Well, sure, there's a lot we can add to that. I think the question we get asked a lot is, if you go to a domestic violence call, do you have to make an arrest? And so, you're doing a good job of describing, these are all the things that the police officers are trained on. Jane has trained this in the police academy for a long time. And so officers they understand the statutes, they understand the requirements. I think the truth of the matter is when we respond to probably 800 or 900 calls for domestic violence every year. And so it is a significant issue in our community. But it's complex, right? Because the emotions run very high. Sometimes the person that's in the abusive relationship, the victim in the case, feels safe when the police get there. So their behavior looks as if they are aggressive because they feel safe now and they can finally say what it is that they want to say to the person, right, to their abuser. So it's a complex thing, and we do the best we can with going through all the statutes and meeting those obligations. But it's hard. And the answer to the question is no, we don't have to arrest somebody just because somebody called us to a house saying there's domestic violence. We have to determine, is there probable cause for a crime? Has a crime here been committed? Is there disorderly conduct that put a victim in fear? Is there a battery that somebody intentionally harmed in some way? And if the answer to that question is yes, the likelihood of somebody getting arrested is very high. But there's a lot of things that go into making a determination of whether or not we're going to arrest somebody at the scene. So it's complex.
Yeah.
But I will say that I appreciate the fact that everybody's here because it's a really significant issue in our community. And it is a very significant issue in the workplace, and the more people in our community that are looking to help and get involved and not say it's a family matter, the better our community is going to be and the safer people will be. So I appreciate you being here.
Thanks.
I would also add that the law is designed to really protect the victim in that the victim no longer needs to tell the officer, I want this case to go forward. They could say, I don't want you to do anything. But if it meets the statute outlined here under 968, we have to arrest. And then hopefully we bring alongside an advocate or a therapist to help that victim understand just the scope of what they're dealing with and hopefully gain additional cooperation along the way.
And that's a really good point that you make, Ben, because in the olden days, a victim would be asked, do you want to press charges? And the district attorney would make a decision based on that, which was putting her in a really bad spot. So when they changed that law and they went for what's called pro-prosecution policy, that really puts the victim in a safer place because it's like, it's not me, it's the law that's doing this, it's the DA that's doing it, so it takes her off of the hot seat, so to speak.
Yeah, and so part of what's really important that we want people to understand around this is the complexities. And so how it takes all of us working together to surround victims with the support that they need to say what's happening. And we're going to get into, with the mandatory arrest, why that's so complex for law enforcement. Because law enforcement gets judged pretty harshly when they make an arrest on something, but the information that they have at the time of the arrest might not be the full story, but they have to address that situation. So there's all these complexities that it takes all of us working together, and so it's critically important for those cases that are in the criminal justice system that advocates from the women's community are partnering with law enforcement to help surround that victim as much as we can to keep them safe. So these are the particular questions that officers have to determine if it's a mandatory arrest. When the law was initially enacted, because of all the complexities, what started happening in the first years of the law was victims were being arrested. Victims were arrested because they may have been acting in self-defense, but that wasn't determined because when officers arrived, they had visible injuries on only one person, so the idea is that person must be the victim. They may have been defensive wounds that people weren't thinking about, again, because we think a victim, when they want help and they call the police, they're going to be cooperative.
Or they're going to be in the corner crying and cowering.
So when they show up and they're not that, or when someone else calls, let's say the neighbor calls, and it wasn't a victim, they don't cooperate. They don't give any information to the officer. So all the officer has is one story. What are they supposed to do? They're trying to figure that out. So it's really, really complex. So part of what then the state did, I think that's on the next slide, is to get into the strategies that help officers understand the complexities of what is happening in this household. So they ask questions about history of domestic violence. And it doesn't have to be documented, it doesn't have to be prior arrest, although those can be very helpful. But talking to everyone in the house, witnesses, to say what is happening in this household, is there a history, have you ever been afraid of this person, getting all those details. So they use these tools to help determine who is the aggressor in that household to the best of their ability. Again, when you have people who aren't willing to share information, that can be very difficult. So as employers, when you're thinking about why wouldn't my employee just tell me that they're a victim? Because there's 100 reasons why. Most of which is they are afraid they're going to lose their job, they're afraid they're going to be shamed, and they are afraid they are going to be hurt further if anyone finds out. So law enforcement has a very difficult job to do in those scenarios. We also have to remember that not all victims want law enforcement involved. So for people who get pulled into the criminal justice system that they wanted no part of, while the law gives some freedom to victims to say, it's not up to me, the state does it, it also puts them in a situation that they have to work extra hard to prove to their partner that they're fighting the system.
And that they're truly loyal to him. Loyalty is
Yes.
a big thing to abusers.
So then they are in a situation now where they're adversarial to the prosecutor, they're adversarial to law enforcement, they're adversarial to everyone in the system because they are trying to stay safe. So these are the complexities that people you are working with are living in.
So this is the power and control wheel. This was developed by the Domestic Abuse Intervention Program out of Duluth, Minnesota, many decades ago. And the way that it was developed was listening to the stories of the victims that came to the shelter for over 10 years, I believe. It was Ellen Pence who developed this. And she put the behaviors into different categories based on how similar she kept hearing stories from all these different victims. So remember at the very beginning, Jane and I said it's a pattern of controlling and coercive behavior. So some of the guys in my group do 3 out of this wheel. Some do all of the pieces of the pie. It varies, but it isn't going to just be like one incident again. It's going to be a pattern over a period of time that you see. So we're going to break this down for you in terms of those different pieces of the pie. So physical abuse, and this may sound silly to you, but I always spell out what physical violence is when I work with the guys in the group, as well as when I work with victims. Because when I ask a woman coming in for a session, are you a victim of domestic violence? A lot of women will say no. They don't recognize it as domestic violence. Because she'll say, well, yeah, it was just pushing, or it was just shoving, or it was just a slap, so therefore that's not domestic violence. And so when I ask women if they've ever had their partner use physical force against them, that's the term I always use, I will say, and by physical force I mean pushing, kicking, slapping, punching, pulling hair, strangling. The vernacular you all use is probably choking, but it's actually strangling. Dragging you across the floor, pulling your hair. I list all the different things that could be physical abuse, and then listen for the answer of what I get from that. So, we're going to talk about this a little bit later as well, but keep this in mind. Sometimes all it takes is one act of violence within an intimate partner relationship to put enough fear in that person that they are fearful of you for the next 20, 30 years. Doesn't have to be violent every day. Because I think, again, when I talk to people in the community, they hear batterers and they go, oh, so that's like somebody who's beating their wife up every single day. Nope. It can be long periods of time in between that physical abuse. Next one is emotional abuse. This is probably the most common form that I hear from the women that I work with as well as the abusers that I work with. So it is name calling, it's put downs, making her think she's crazy. What you maybe older people in the group would know as gaslighting. It's funny, the other day we were talking about this at work, at the lunch table, and a couple of my young staff said, "What is gaslighting? Where's that from?" I said, "Actually, it's from a very old movie. It's a black and white movie that I'm sure you've never seen, where a husband kept turning the gas lights up and down and acting like he didn't know how that was happening, and so he was making his wife think she was crazy." That's where that term comes from. Playing mind games, embarrassing her, humiliating her, making her feel bad about herself, making her feel guilty. Those are all emotionally abusive tactics. So again, I want to go back to, have you maybe ever called your husband a bad name? Have you ever said to your partner, "Boy, you're stupid," or "that was stupid"? Doesn't mean you're an abuser if you did that once. It's a pattern that happens over time. And emotional abuse is probably the most devastating form of abuse. When I talk to victims, they say to me, the physical abuse is bad, but the emotional abuse is 100 times worse. Because those physical bruises, broken bones even will heal, but when you are emotionally abusing someone, you're attacking their psyche, their inner soul, and that's something that's much, much more difficult to heal. Next one is isolation. This is very common with the guys that I deal with in my group. So just like Jane talked about trying to get her fired from her job so that she's economically dependent on him, another reason he does that is because he doesn't want her out in the world talking to other people. He wants to have total control over everything she eats, sleeps, and breathes. He wants that to be information that he's given her. He's also hypersensitive about her having any kind of interaction with men. Vast majority of abusers have very low self-esteem. They feel inadequate, they feel insecure, and they're hypersensitive that their partner's going to leave them and find some other guy that's better than they are. So in the workplace, guess who works there? Men. So I'm going to try and keep her away from men. So that's one reason that they will use isolation. A lot of times they will try to curtail how much involvement she has with her family, because what do you think her family or friends are saying to her? "I'm worried about how he treats you. I noticed when he said this to you or when he did that." So they're trying to help her see that maybe she's in an unhealthy relationship. He doesn't want that. He wants to keep her under his thumb, so he wants to keep her away from that. Using jealousy to justify actions is a very, very common thing with abusers. I always tell teenage girls, when you're in a relationship with a boy and he's super jealous, this is what teenage girls say to me: "Oh, that's so sweet. That means he really loves me. Isn't that great? He's jealous." And I say, "No, it's not. That's a horrible, horrible big red flag. If there's a lot of jealousy, that means he feels territorial about you, as in you are my property and no one else should be talking to you or having anything to do with you. And it also means that he has very low self-esteem and feels inadequate." So jealousy, not a good thing. Threats and coercion. Very, very common tactic that abusers will use, especially after there's been one act of violence. It's much easier than to threaten someone because you have a level of fear that you have instilled in them. So it's as simple sometimes as making or carrying out threats that you're going to physically harm her. It's threatening to commit suicide. A lot of guys will do that because they know that she's going to feel bad and she's going to feel guilty if he commits suicide, so then she agrees to stay with him. Typically, that's when I see guys pull that out of their toolbox, is when she's going to leave. That's when he starts threatening to commit suicide. He might be threatening to leave her and leave her with her kids, leave her without enough money, threatening to report her to social services or some other authority if he believes that there's something she's done that is against any of those laws or rules. He might actually force her to do illegal things, because then it's kind of like, okay, you're in the same boat I am, and you can't leave now because we have this illegal bond between the two of us, for lack of a better word.
And they use that to hang over their heads. So, oh, if you leave me, I'm going to call the police, and I have all this evidence against you for all these things that you did, though I made you do them, but I have all this evidence. So they use that to hang it over their head. If you try to leave me, I'm going to call the police, and you're going to go to prison.
Right. And trying to get the charges dropped. Obviously, this will was invented before many of the states moved into pro-prosecution and where the victims no longer have the ability, although there's maybe some states that still have that outlet, where the victim is asked whether or not she wants to press charges. Intimidation, making her afraid by using dirty looks, gestures, actions of any sort, pounding his fist down on the table, shaking his fist at her, raising his hand like he's going to hit her. There's all kinds of different ways that, again, if there's been physical abuse in the past, it's much easier to then intimidate. smashing things, destroying property. Sometimes it's her property, it might be his property. Abusing pets, displaying weapons. My favorite example over all my years of dealing with abusers was a guy who had smashed his wife's glass collection of something. And when we walked through that with him, we're like, because his rationale was, oh, I have a bad temper. That's always the number one excuse, which is a bunch of BS. I had a bad temper, I just snapped. I couldn't help myself, I couldn't control myself. That's what these guys always say. And so my co-facilitator said, well, let's talk about that for a second. So where exactly were you standing when this happened? He's like, well, I was on like the left side of the room. Okay, and were there things around you that you could have picked up and thrown? Well, yeah, there was this, he listed all these things. So my co-facilitator said, and where was the glass collection of her precious animal? Well, it was on the other side of the living room. So he walked all the way across, picked up her stuff on purpose, smashed it, because what is the message he's trying to give her? This could be you next. I'm smashing this, it's an object, but the next thing I might lash out is you. So did he really lose control? Did he snap? No. If that were true, he'd pick up whatever was right next to him. And I remember him even saying, well, no, that was my stuff. Like, I didn't want to break my stuff. So I'm like, okay, there you go. It's not about I'm losing control.
And I think the other thing for people to really think about, pets are critically important in our lives. And for many victims, the reason that they are staying in the relationship is because of pets. And abusers use this very effectively to keep victims in their control. We worked with a victim, I remember, that she came home and she had this beautiful white cat that was her love, and she came in and there was a white stuffed animal cat hanging from a noose in her garage. Here's the message, right? I mean, loud and clear. So it's all of those kind of games that they do to make victims feel like they can never know what's going to be happening.
Really, that's a good point, keeping them off balance. I'm going to give you an example also of displaying weapons that goes back to what Chief Ben Bliven talked about. I had a woman years ago who had been arrested for domestic violence because she punched her partner right in front of the cops when the cops showed up on the scene. When I interviewed her to see if she was appropriate for our domestic abusers program, I asked her, what were you hoping to accomplish when you did that? And here's what her answer was. And I took the history from her, so it had been years that she had suffered abuse at the hands of this man. He then, on this day, was getting out his gun. And he had his gun on the table, didn't say anything, took it out and just kept cleaning it. And they had been arguing for the last 2 days. Just kept cleaning it. Didn't say a word, but she knew what that meant. She knew that that weapon on that kitchen table meant, you better watch your P's and Q's and do what I want. Something else occurred, I can't remember what happened. The police ended up being called, and I don't know if a neighbor called or if she called or what happened, but then when the cops got there, of course she's lived with this for so long, she's so angry, so she cold cocks him. And she said, the reason I did that was because I knew the officer was standing right there, and I knew he couldn't hit me back, and for once I felt like I got some justification after so many times of being abused. Makes perfect sense when you hear the backstory of how that all happens. Okay, sexual abuse. Physically forcing someone to have sexual intercourse, obviously that's sexual abuse. But it can be physically forcing her to do other sexual acts. It could be coercing sex in a way she doesn't feel comfortable with and she doesn't like. It could be not respecting her no, so guilting her into saying yes, coercing her into saying yes, or actually physically intimidating her to have sex.
And this is something, again, that you can't have, in a power imbalance, you can't have healthy sexual relationships. So when you are afraid of someone, consenting to sex is not completely an option. When you fear that if you don't consent, what's going to happen. Sexual violence happens all the time in abusive relationships. It's the least thing that we talk about. In general, we don't like to talk about sex. We really don't like to talk about sexual assault. So for intimate partner violence, when the sexual abuse is occurring, very rarely is that discussed or talked about. And it's recently, within the last decade actually, that every state made marriage was not a bar to prosecution for sexual assault. So even within the last decade, it was still thought that once you were married, there was no, you didn't have any rights to say no. So if your husband wanted to have sex with you and you said no, they rape you, no recourse.
Yep.
So-
Judges would throw it out before that. Actually, the first state, I believe, was Oregon, and it was 1975 or 76, when a woman was able to have her husband charged with rape, and the judge allowed it to go to court and not throw it out. Up until then, it was like, no, this is just your woman, this is part of what it is, you took marriage vows, and you have to do that. Next one, using children. Using kids to relay messages to her. Sometimes that might be appropriate messages, it's usually not inappropriate messages. Making her feel guilty about the kids, which is usually made up stuff. Threatening to take the kids away from her. Using visitation to harass her if they are separated or divorced. Next one is economic abuse. Simply as taking her money, making her turn over her paycheck at the end of the week or every 2 weeks, or not letting her know about family income or have access to certain pots of money from the family income, preventing her from getting a job or keeping a job like we talked about before, making her ask for money, giving her an allowance, saying this is how much you're going to have each week, treating her like a child instead of an adult. Male privilege. Expecting her to do all the housework, because that's woman's work. No, I'm a man. I do the lawn mowing, I do this, and then I'm done at the end of the day, right? Treating her like a servant, expecting her to do all the childcare. He might have the belief system that he's the man of the house, so therefore he's going to make all the big decisions. Acting like the master of the castle, being the one to define what's men's and women's roles. When we do a week on each of these in the SAFE program, and guys have homework assignments where you have to write down what they've done that fits into each of these pieces of the pie. And this is the week that, interestingly, nobody can ever see anything they do. And I'm like, well, let's talk about that. So we give out a few examples, we throw things out from our own lives, my father life, my father-in-law, and then they start coming around. But it's interesting how they'll be like, well, yeah, I help out with the housework. So we're like, okay, think about that term, help out. If you went to your job and you turned to your coworker that day and said, I'm going to help you out today, how would that go over? It's like, well, we're a team. We're supposed to be sharing the responsibility of this job. So if I'm going to help you out, that's giving the impression that it's your job, but I'm just being a nice person and I'm helping you with that, right? So many times those guys can't see that they are defining that. The other thing we do is we have a list of all kinds of different chores and things that happens in any household, and to mark down how much of that they do or how often they do. And it's interesting when they'll say, like, well, I'll do this, but I'm not doing that. Like, I'm not doing windows, or I'm not cleaning toilets. It's like, that's male privilege. To say, well, I'm the one that's allowed to say, I'm not doing that on the list, so therefore, you have to do it because I'm not willing to do it. So male privilege is way more subtle, but it's pretty significant in our culture. And minimizing, denying, and blaming. This goes specifically to after you've been abusive, typically, that he'll make light of the abuse, like it's no big deal. He'll say, why can't she get over this? It was just this, or I only did it once. I pushed her, you know, it's not like I beat her up every day. I mean, I hear all kinds of minimizations with the guys in my group.
And to say things, if you would have only done this, I wouldn't have had to do that.
Right.
You know, it just makes me so angry when X, Y, Z. So always shifting that blame instead of saying, taking responsibility for the own behavior. And all of that's happening, so in the minds of victims, they're trying to figure all this stuff out and figure out what the rules are. And the rules are always changing. So they keep thinking, if I can only do this better, everything will be okay. And they believe that they have bought into the lies that it's their fault and that they can control the happiness of their partner. So the gaslighting, the brainwashing, I mean, really what's happening is we're dealing with people who are literally brainwashed. Their brain is affected differently because of the ongoing crazy making that they're a part of and the breaking down of their self-esteem so that they don't believe they have any ability to make a decision that is worthwhile. They don't believe that anyone else would ever love them. The thing that we really have to understand for victims in abusive relationships is they don't necessarily want the relationship to end. They want the abuse to stop. Mm-hmm. Those are two really, really different things. Leaving an abusive relationship is not always the goal. And for most victims, it's not the goal. They want their partner to return to the person they fell in love with. Mm-hmm. They want that person. Hope is this really powerful thing. They believe that if they can just stick it out, and do everything the right way, their partner will change and the abuse will stop. And so that's why we're, having all these conversations and dialogue and trying to get people to understand what's happening in the minds of victims when they're at your place of employment and they come in with visible injuries and they say nothing happened or they make excuses. It's not because they enjoy it, it's not because they deserve it, it's not because there's something wrong with them. It's they're trying to figure all of this stuff out and they don't want anybody to hate their partner. They love this person who is hurting them. So it's all of these dynamics that we really have to think about in trying to understand how surrounding a victim with support takes a lot of knowledge and understanding of what's happening in their mind.
Which brings us to the cycle of violence. This is a super important concept for people to understand, and it helps people understand why a victim would stay in an abusive relationship. What you're seeing is the cycle, and there's 3 parts to this cycle. There's the tension building phase, the escalation phase, the violence phase, and then there's the honeymoon phase. So let me walk you through how this would maybe go. And you'll notice on the bottom it has time. It varies from days to weeks to months. The time that this happens is different in every relationship. Some people go through this cycle every single day. Some people go through it every few weeks. Some go through it every few months. Some might go through it once a year or every few years. So it's very different depending on the relationship and the abuser. So in that escalation phase, what's happening to begin with, like I said earlier, the abuser is feeling very inadequate and insecure. In our culture, there's something called the man code. And a big part of the man code is you don't admit that you feel insecure. You don't ask for help. You make sure that you exude confidence and like you've got the answers to everything. So if I'm a man and I'm feeling inadequate, insecure, I've got to cover that up. And sometimes the easiest way to do that is by pretending the opposite and making a lot of bravado and making it look like I have all the answers and everybody else is screwed up, especially because my partner, she's very screwed up and I'm just here to try and show her the right way. So as that insecurity grows and builds, he feels very hypervigilant about his partner doing anything that might embarrass him, that might show that in his perception that she's being disloyal to him. It gets to the top of the scale, and then there's a choice to strike out as a way to control the situation or to control the victim. So let me give you an example. And I'm totally making this up, okay? For everybody, for my husband's sake, I'm making this up. Let's pretend that I go out to dinner tonight with my husband, Mike, and a couple of our really good friends. During the course of dinner, the other couple starts telling cute and funny stories about stupid stuff they did when they were kids. Everybody's laughing. I tell a story about stupid stuff I did when I was a little girl. People laughing. I also decided to tell a story about something Mike did when he was a little boy that was really stupid that his mom told me about. People laugh. However, unbeknownst to me, my husband is not happy that I told that story. He's feeling embarrassed. He shouldn't feel embarrassed, no one else would, but because of his lack of self-esteem and his confidence, he feels embarrassed about that. So during dinner, he's stewing. He holds it in, he doesn't say anything. We get to our house, the privacy of our home, shuts the door and he starts yelling and screaming at me. And I'm not going to say the words that probably would be said in a situation like that because we're taping this on public access channel. But he would call me all kinds of horrible names. And then let's say he backhands me and says, I can't believe you told that story. Okay, that moment in time, what do you think I would be feeling?
Shock.
Shock. What else would I be feeling? He's just backhanded me. What was that?
Guilt for confiding something?
I might be feeling guilty because let's go back to those defense mechanisms that I talked about earlier. Our brain tries to make sense of things that don't make sense. And so defense mechanisms kick in and I think, you know what? Maybe I should have known to not tell that story. And so I'm going to blame myself. Or I might think, well, he's been under a lot of stress at work lately, so that must be why he did that. Because I'm trying to make a reason for why the man I love, the mother of my children, has just hit me, right? Or I might think, well, you know, he had 2 or 3 beers at dinner. That was probably 1 too many beers. It's the alcohol that made him do that. So I'm automatically trying to think of excuses for why this happened because my brain just can't make sense of it. The other thing I'm going to be feeling more than the shock and more than the guilt is what? Starts with an F. Fear.
Fear.
Absolutely. I am going to be fearful of him. The moment that I am fearing an intimate partner, it shifts that balance of power in a relationship. In a healthy relationship, there's an equal balance of power. Neither of them has more power than the other. Both people feel safe with each other. Both people have equal access to the resources within that relationship. At that moment in time, when a person's been hit and they fear the other person, it changes that balance of power like that. He's now up here with the upper hand, literally and figuratively. I'm down here with not much power. Okay? So we're at the top of this scale. Now, what do you think he's going to be feeling? After he sees my reaction, he sees my shock, he sees my hurt, probably my tears, what do you think he's going to be feeling?
Power.
What was that?
Power.
Power. And that's going to last for a split second. What's he going to feel after that?
Remorse.
Remorse and guilt, unless he's a sociopath. If he's a sociopath, he's not going to care. But we're going to say in this instance, this person's not. He's going to start feeling guilty. So, when people feel guilty, what do? They try to get out of feeling guilty. Oh, it's a human being reaction, right? So he might say this, well, if you hadn't said that, I wouldn't have done that, so therefore it's your fault, right? Twisting the tables. Or he might do the same thing I was doing in my head. You know, I've been under a lot of stress at work, that's what caused me to do that. So he's getting himself off the hook. Or he might say, I had too many beers to drink. It was the alcohol that made me do that, Lee. I'm so, so sorry. So typically, it moves into that honeymoon phase where he starts apologizing. I'm so sorry. I can't believe I did that to you. Please forgive me. I promise I'll never do it again. And of course, I want to believe this. This is the man I love, the mother of my children. Maybe we've been together 5 years. I'm not going to throw that out the window, right? Because of one incident. So that honeymoon phase is what sucks me back in. Because I believe that it's not going to happen again. I believe that there's all these extenuating circumstances. And on top of it, he starts treating me like a queen. He buys me that favorite dress I've been looking at downtown in the window. He takes me out to dinner. He does everything on my honey-do list. He cleans out the garage, right? He does everything he can think of to make me feel okay again and to get back into my good graces. What does that sound like? That sounds like the courtship period of a relationship. When you're dating somebody and you have those butterflies in your stomach, you can't wait to see them, and they treat you wonderful and everything's great. That produces a lot of chemicals in the brain, like serotonin, which is what's in antidepressants. That makes you feel wonderful and great about the other person, and it makes you stay in that relationship because, again, you're believing that it's not going to happen again. However, without intervention, anything happening differently for the abuser, without him dealing with his stuff inside, it's going to happen again. And this next slide shows you, over a period of time, 3 different violent episodes. What happens is, as you notice, it gets more severe as time goes on. That's one pattern that we see. Or believe it or not, as time goes on, there is no more physical violence. So let me give you 2 different examples of that. Feel free to jump in when you want. So one example would be the first time it was that backhand, okay? There's a honeymoon phase, things seem to be going well. Maybe 8 months later, another incident of something occurs, and he now punches me. It's a higher level of violence. Because I've been desensitized to some of the earlier stuff, he needs to use a higher level of violence to instill that same amount of fear in me and keep control of me. As time goes on, it gets to be worse and worse and worse and worse. The analogy I try to use with people is think about when you were a little kid and you heard somebody swearing and you thought that was just horrible. Oh my gosh, they're saying those horrible words. And as you get older, you hear a lot more swearing, a lot more, and you kind of get desensitized to it, and it's no big deal. Believe it or not, physical abuse can be that way. You get used to it, and so over time. The second pattern that we see sometimes with guys is they've been physically abusive once and only once because he was able to make her afraid of him enough that it lasted for the whole next 30, 40 years of that relationship. Because the fear is there, then he can use those threatening things like smashing his finger down, holding his hand out, saying threatening things to her, and she backs down and kowtows and does whatever he wants her to do. So it isn't the amount of violence that's the issue. It is the control factor. It's the power factor. And that's where all those other parts of the wheel come into play. So let's go back to the silly example I used of being out to dinner. Let's say it is 5 years after that incident. We're at a big party. And there's lots of people talking about the exact same thing, about stupid stuff when we were little kids. I have this great funny story that I could tell about my husband that would get a big laugh. Do you think I would tell that story again? Absolutely not. I would never do that again. And not only is it going to just be that story, it's going to permeate into every part of our relationship. I'm going to watch his face like a hawk. Whenever we're doing anything, I'm going to be looking, I'm going to be hyper vigilant. Is he getting upset? Is he getting angry? Should I not be saying this? Should I change that? And then it might go into other parts where he starts criticizing how I'm dressing. You know, that's awfully too short of a skirt for you to be wearing. Okay? I'm going to change that because I don't want to get him upset. He might start complaining about how much time I spend on the phone with my sister, so I'm going to cut back on that. He might start complaining about me going out with my friends. Could be all kinds of different things. It all gets all mushed into that whole big cycle and that pattern of that controlling abusive behavior.
So an extreme example of how that might work with one episode. So a husband pushes they're in an altercation, and it's all of those tactics in place, and he pushes his wife down the basement stairs. So she falls, hits her head, is knocked out from hitting her head, goes and gets recovery, doesn't tell anyone that that's what happened. And for the rest of their marriage, if she was ever getting out of line, he would say, "You don't want to take another trip, do you?" And she knew exactly what that meant. And so she would do whatever he needed her to do, one violent episode, but it permeated their entire marriage, that she knew what that meant.
So a lot of times when I work with victims who have been in an abusive relationship for years, I show them this cycle of violence and they're like, oh my God, this is exactly how it was. We do this with the guys in group in like week 3 or 4, and it's interesting, there's always, almost always a shift after we do this. Because the guys who've been denying and like, oh, it's just the court system, this is a money-making venture, the cops just arrest everybody. We do this cycle and they see themselves in it and they're like, oh God, okay, maybe I do need to pay attention to this. And we explain to them why mandatory arrest was created. It was to save lives. And that instead of just going back to the same house again and again for law enforcement, they now have the opportunity to marry that with a treatment program so that people can stop that abusive behavior, and then it makes more sense. The other sad thing about this cycle that we point out to the guys is that guess what's happening when those abusive things are going on, whether it's emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, coercion, there's little eyes and ears hearing that in those houses. And those are the kids that grow up, unfortunately, high percentage to be the next generation of abusers and the next generation of victims.
So we added this in here because as we're looking at all of that stuff, you say, oh, if you recognize yourself in any of those things, again, remember it's a pattern of behavior. So we also want people to know that this is what a healthy relationship looks like. So in your handouts with this is the equality wheel. So if we look at what the opposite is when you're saying, oh, you know, I did these things, this is what a healthy relationship looks like. And we want people to understand that too. So we give this to you as a tool to recognize that there is a balance. So we have a little short TED Talk video clip for you that kind of just emphasizes and really helps understand from a survivor's perspective what was happening in her mind in her relationship.
So that, I think, is a very powerful video that shows you one woman's perspective, and yet she's really speaking for many women, that shows you what it's like to be a victim. And that's a very harsh example. And again, I want to go back to the first session. We talked about that abuse is on a continuum. So it can be a smaller amount of terrorism that's going on, all the way up to actually killing a partner. And she shows you some of the more difficult, terroristic kind of things that he did. But the pattern that she talks about is something that I hear a lot from the victims that I work with, and I'm sure the same for you, Jane.
Right.
So when someone has been in a situation like that, it impacts the brain. We want to talk a little bit about what that does. You probably all have heard over the years about the fight or flight response that we have, but we now have done more brain research and we realize there's a third response in that. It's fight, flight, or freeze response, where someone's amygdala in their brain gets activated to the part that they either freeze and can't do anything, they get numbed, or they fight, or they have flight back. When that's happening over a long period of time, there's all kinds of chemicals going through the body and the brain that impacts the brain, which can result in a loss of memory of parts of the event or the entire event. It can be a loss of executive functioning. Executive functioning is this part of your brain. So if you look at where it says frontal lobe, that's this part here, and the amygdala is in the middle part. Then you have the olfactory bulb, the hypothalamus, and the thalamus, and the hippocampus, which is where memory is stored. When traumatic events occur, it interferes with memory because the hippocampus is not able to register that in the right part of the brain. And so it kind of comes and goes in pieces. You probably have had an experience like that in your lifetime. Like if you've ever been in a car accident, if you had something very frightening happen to you. Sometimes people say, I can't remember the car accident. Or I remember bits and pieces of it, but I can't remember all of it. I think a long, long time ago, people assumed that was because there must have been some sort of a injury to the brain, but people who have not hit their head on anything but have had a traumatic event occur have trouble remembering that. So I want to talk about how the brain is built a little bit. It's built from the bottom up, as in when you are a small child, the brain stem starts first, and then the midbrain, and then the executive functioning is built after that. What happens in times of trauma is that the brain is flooded with a bunch of different chemicals, one of which is called catecholamines. And as that floods the front part of the brain, it shuts down the executive function. You can't make good decisions. You can't make decisions at all. And it goes back to that reptilian brain, which is what you see for the crisis survival brain. So lots of research has shown when someone is living in a traumatic situation over extended period of time, they are operating out of that crisis survival brain like 85-95% of the time. So they are on high alert, and there's all kinds of different stress hormones that are flooding through their body all the time.
And it literally, when people are like, what were they thinking? They can't. When you're in that hyper state all the time, the hyperarousal, all those chemicals in your brain, literally they can't make rational, logical decisions. The chemicals prevent the brain from accessing that. So they are working only from a point of survival. So what are they thinking? They're thinking, how do I live through this? That's the level that they have the ability to think about. And we see that with folks that come into our shelter program. When they come in, they're living in this kind of state, and after they've been away from that toxic environment, even for a few days, their chemicals start to regulate and they can start to see things in a different way. And sometimes it's just a few days, and then after they've been with us for a couple of weeks, their world completely shifts and they can start to really see things differently. And they're like, wait a minute, I know this, I can make a decision. Yep, you can. But they literally have to be out of that toxic environment so that their brain can flush and start to really rewire itself to normal functioning.
And you couple that with the fact that probably her abusers have been brainwashing her for years. That's a very common tactic I see with abusers. Telling her it's blue sky when it's really a white sky. I mean, tearing down her self-esteem to the point that she doesn't really think she can make any decisions because she's had 20 years of them telling her how stupid she is, how fat she is, how she can't do anything. And so she has no sense of what we call ego strength in terms of psychological functioning. Couple that with the trauma brain going on, and you have someone who just is not able to function as well as they were before. So we want to talk about lethality factors because this is something as well that you can apply to your workplaces in terms of when to be concerned about an employee, if you're a management person or a coworker. These, I'm going to give you 10 different lethality factors, and these are based off of Barbara Hart's work out of Pennsylvania, where she studied a large variety of abusive relationships and men who had either committed homicide or attempted to commit homicide and suicide. So number one on the list is number one for a reason. Threats of homicide or suicide. So many times I have worked with victims over the years who, when I ask about, I go through a checklist of all the different behaviors of what he maybe has done to her, and when we get to the threats, this is what typically she'll say. Well, yeah, he threatened to kill me, and he threatened to do this, but I know he didn't mean that. I'm always like, no, 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 no. The minute you hear someone is threatening to harm you physically, they're threatening to kill you, do not assume they don't mean it. They do. It is one of the biggest predictors of some of the biggest homicides and homicide-suicides that we've had in the domestic violence relationships. Number 2, fantasies of homicide or suicide. So he's maybe not saying that to her, but if he's been interviewed by maybe a psychologist or a mental health professional, and he admits that he's having those fantasies, huge, huge, huge lethality factor. So in my world, when I hear that, I'm like, okay, I know that this is a high-risk guy. 3rd is weapons. Just owning weapons is a lethality factor. In a joking way, once I was at a conference out of state, and I remember someone saying, well, do you ask about weapons when you do your lethality factor? And I said, well, yeah, I do, but it's Wisconsin. Everybody's got weapons, especially in hunting season. So I automatically just assume that there's going to be that risk because they can easily get those weapons. 4, ownership of the battered partner. As in, kind of what I talked about before, the territorialism. I own her, she belongs to me, nobody else should be able to have access to her, people shouldn't be talking to her, she shouldn't be having outside involvement with friends out of work, you name it. That ownership is a very difficult and scary thing, which is piggyback to centrality of the partner. So centrality of your partner means your whole life centers around her. He cannot envision his life without her. Those guys scare me to death because those are the guys that are going to do the homicide, suicide. It's like when she's threatened she's going to leave him, or when she makes plans that she's going to leave and divorce him. That's why we spend a lot of time with victims making sure we have an ironclad plan, waterproof, airtight plan for how she's going to be able to exit that relationship and still be safe. The 6th one is separation violence. So as in, she's separated from him, and the violence is escalating, going up. 7th one is depression. High number of men who have committed homicide with an intimate partner suffered from depression. Access to the victim and or to the family members. I was going to give you an example, but that hasn't gone to court yet, so I probably shouldn't talk about that. So there are times where an abuser will say, I know the best way to get at her is to harm her family. And so it might not be her that's killed or harmed, but it might be family members. Number 9, repeated outreach to law enforcement. So if you've got a case where you know that there's been a lot of calls to law enforcement, sometimes I think people think, oh yeah, it's just, it's the Joneses again. They're arguing this is the umpteenth time. That actually you should be more worried about, more concerned, because there's been more and more incidents. And the last one is escalation of battery risk. As in, the guy that's being abusive, is he risking more and more things as a way to try to gain control over her? For example, maybe in the beginning of the relationship, he would never abuse her in front of kids. Now he's doing it in front of kids. He doesn't care. Maybe before, he would make sure that he wasn't stalking her at work, but now he's stalking at work. It's very public. More people know about it. That's taking more risks of getting caught. That's what I mean by that. Anything you want to add to that? Anything you guys want to add to that? Okay. So let's talk about what can employers do. This is just 4 things that we're going to throw out today. The next session, we're going to cover a lot of things on what employers can do and how to help victims, employees. So number 1, ask the person who is displaying inappropriate behavior to leave your premises. I think a lot of times employers have the mindset like this is a public entity, we're a business, we're open to the public. Yes and no. You are a private business. You have the right to say you're not allowed on my property, and I'm going to kick you off of my property, and I'm going to call law enforcement because you're trespassing. Secondly, have a semi-annual training for all of your employees about domestic violence and how to recognize it. You heard the woman on the TED Talk about how when we keep that silence, that is the worst thing for domestic violence. So if everyone knows about it, how to recognize it, they can reach out to a coworker and a friend, or if you're a manager, reach out to an employee. Third one, ask the employee who is being victimized what accommodations do they need or want in order to be safe and to keep their coworkers safe. Oftentimes, they have very good ideas on what could be done that would help everyone be safe. Number 4, research workplace policies on domestic violence and develop one for the particular needs of your company. There's a lot of different workplace violence policies. We have brought copies of the women's community. Did you put those back there?
No.
They're up here. So we have one for you to refer to, but there's many other ones I would suggest you look on the web and see what you can find.
So just a couple other things. On point number 1 about asking someone to leave, again, remember this is a tactic that abusive people use. They come to places of employment to harass their partners to try to get them fired. So then people are like, well, is that going to make it worse? If I tell them to leave the property, are they then going to take it out on their partner? Am I protecting the partner by not doing that? And it's a similar thing with the question about calling law enforcement. So I think I may have said that at the last session, but I'll just say in my tenure, I've changed my mindset on that. That abusive people don't need a reason to abuse. They're already doing it. They already find whatever excuse they need to make up in their head. You providing an intervention is not going to make it worse for them. They may say it did, but they are doing it already. The only thing at this point in time that I know is nothing changes if intervention doesn't happen. They're already abusive. It's already in silence. Nothing changes. There's no reason for that behavior to change. If you're aware of something, make that call. If someone is coming to your place of employment that is harassing one of your employees, put the onus on them to stay off your property. Don't ask your employees to control their partners. They can't. So that's critically important to think about. The other thing in talking about having trainings around how to respond to that is, again, you absolutely know someone who is experiencing abuse. And when you provide trainings, it's a non-threatening way for people who might not recognize that, as if the woman who wrote Crazy Love. She said, I didn't know it was abusive. But when we make this our language, when we talk about how these behaviors are inappropriate, then victims who are in your employ can start to recognize that. And so the training is not only on how do we respond to our coworkers, but victims who are sitting there getting that training are learning how to help themselves as well. So that's critically important, to have ongoing trainings, ongoing discussions, so we can remove the shame, and so that victims know they're not going to be treated unfairly or asked those questions.
So we're going to hand out copies of the women's community's workplace domestic violence policy. But again, the next session, we're going to talk even more at length about that. We want to leave time for questions, either of Jane or I, or of our law enforcement personnel that are here. So anyone have any questions? But and remember, seriously, there are no dumb questions. If there's something you want to ask about, please do so.
I just have one other thing to reiterate from the TED Talk about it can happen to anyone. So no one is immune from being abused. So a few years ago, a director of a domestic abuse program in Marinette was murdered by her boyfriend. So someone whose life and career was devoted to operating a domestic abuse agency was living in abuse and was murdered. So no one is immune. So if you think at my place of employment this would never happen, it can happen anywhere, for all of those reasons that we've talked about. So when we go to that denial place, when we try to make excuses, just know it happens everywhere, and we all need to be thinking about it.
Here's some additional resources. So there's the Women's Community's number. It's in your packet, as well as Peaceful Solutions Counseling, and then also National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And Abuse Wisconsin is the local state for that, and Futures Without Violence.
Any other questions that people had that? Yeah.
I'd say just a couple of things. One is, Jane and Lee are certainly the experts because they work in this every single day, so they've given a lot of great information, and I think we work collaboratively together in our community, and I think we're lucky for that. But I would say, one of the most important things that we try to do with the police department is have a good culture within our police department, because just like your workplace, we're not immune to these types of issues. We have a huge policy manual. It's probably this thick and put it together. It's all online now, so we don't print it out anymore. But just because we have a policy and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy to know how to respond. You can go to the policy manual and say, okay, here are the steps I should take. But if you don't know, if somebody comes to you and says, this issue is going on in my life, I'm concerned about them coming to work, or they're just asking for your help in this situation, call us. Call the police department. We would love to help safety plan in the workplace. We would love to sit down and talk with you, with or without the employee that's experiencing that issue, and help come up with a game plan on how you can stay safe, how you can help this person. I know Lee and Jane would say the same thing. Call us and let us help you. You don't have to know the answers to everything. We won't know the answers to everything, but we'll work through it with you. And so we want to be a resource for you in our community. So we have people that are very good at, and specialize in working with victims of crime within our police department. Obviously, the women's community has people that are capable of that. But don't feel like you have to know everything. There are resources. We want to help you. We've done lots of work with businesses in our community to help them through situations like this. And it's an important thing for us to be involved in. So don't feel like you're bothering us. Please call us if you think there's anything that we can do to help you. We would love to do that. So just want to put that out there, that it's to know that you're not bothering us by calling us. We want to help.
And I want to add that at the police department, they have a full-time mental health therapist on staff, which is funded through VOCA, Victims of Crime Act. Her name is Kristen Seidler. She has the ability to meet with people at the police department or at the women's committee in the schools. If you've been a victim of any type of crime, it does not have to have been actually reported. She's able to see you free of charge. So that is a resource for anyone who's feeling like they maybe need some help healing from the trauma that they've experienced.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add things from an employer perspective. My name is Carrie Ann, and my older sister was murdered by her husband in 2013. She was a 2001 DC Everest graduate. We actually learned of of her being missing from her employer. She didn't show up for work. And so the emergency contact that they had on file, she had listed a friend of hers and then our mom. And the friend hadn't heard from Kira, and then they did contact my mom, and then they had reached out to her husband at the time, who then had made a missing persons report. And so I think, oh my gosh, here we are, we're learning about this, what we need to be aware of as employers. And here that's actually how, through Kira's employer, how we found out that she was missing originally. So I just wanted to pay attention to that today. And having those emergency contact on file and not being afraid to follow up and see if your employee is safe. It's definitely something that we should be doing. And then also I wanted to just mention something about the trauma part about it. After my sister had passed away, as surviving family members, we had experienced a lot of trauma with her missing. And we talk about memory loss and how that all works. And I can tell you that a good 2 years of my life, after having gone through the trial and everything that happened with Kira being missing and learning about how she had passed and things, does take a really hard mental toll on you. And there's a good 2 years where I'm like, what happened to my life during 2013 to 2015? It's hard to recall things because your brain chemicals change and there's so much added stress so it's a very normal thing I learned, because I was like, am I losing my mind? Yeah. But that, the stress and things, it really does. So, reading about that, I felt that way. I know what that's like, so I can relate to that as well.
Thank you for sharing that information.
So I handed out for folks, just as a point of reference, again, you could Google and find other documents, but this is the employer response to domestic violence that the women's community has. So this is our policy on how we would respond to someone who might be a victim that is also an employee of our agency. In addition to how we would respond if an employee of our agency was served as a respondent in a restraining order or had been arrested or charged with conduct of domestic abuse. So those are things to be thinking about in your, as an employer, how you want to handle kind of both sides of that equation, because there is the keeping the victim safe side, but also for your employers to think about the ramifications of having someone in your employee who is a convicted offender and what that might mean. So just things to consider.
So thank you all very much for coming. Again, if you want to share this information with other people, feel free to make copies of the PowerPoint. It is on the public access channel, and I think, do I have that? Oh, I do. So at the very last slide, that's the link to get to the public access channel to view this if you want.
And again, we have our last session in January 22nd. And we will actually be in the Health Services Building here on campus.
The Health Sciences Building?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
So thank you all.
Thank you all very much. Have a great afternoon.